classifications, and in statute you have to come through and change the classification, and these are changing up, so the waters are getting cleaner. Unless I'm mistaken, I don't think anything went backwards today.
No,
I can't. You can't. Right, you can't. No, there's backwards. Anyway, so there's some, as they meet the new classifications, the department comes in and officially upgrades them. And the last one creates a sustenance fishing designated use for Maine's water classification program on waters where there is sustenance fishing for some Indian citizens. This is a new designated use for water bodies, and it focuses on eating fish. So, Commissioner, do you want to lead us off on this one?
Sure. So there's a long history to this, which I won't take time to describe in any detail, but it has its roots as far back as the 1990s when Brooke Barnes was in a leadership position at the DEP, and the department was applying for delegation of the Clean Water Act permitting program known as NIPTES to EPA, and as part of that, the state had to make a demonstration that it had adequate jurisdiction to implement the program in the state, and entails making a showing of jurisdiction within Indian lands. And so the application did make that showing, but it became a point of contention between the state and the tribes and EPA as to whether that showing was adequate, and that ended up in court. And so that was kind of the debate among the state, the tribes, and EPA over to what extent the state has jurisdiction, particularly with respect to clean water issues in Indian territory in the state. And so the discharge permitting program, but before too long, it became clear that the same issue was presenting itself in the context of water quality standards. The state has to develop and submit to EPA for federal approval water quality standards, and they don't become effective for Clean Water Act purposes until approved by EPA. And so the same issue is coming up in the context of the state's annual submissions to EPA when DEP would seek approval of its water quality standards. EPA was starting to, in those annual approval letters, accept Indian waters from the scope of its approval. So this issue of whether the state had jurisdiction was continuing to arise. And eventually, it's clear to me that the state does have jurisdiction. It's very clear in the Settlement Acts under Section 6204 that the state's environmental regulatory jurisdiction applies uniformly to Indian lands, water, to the same areas of the state. And so that point was affirmed in some of the litigation that ensued. But the issue of whether Maine's water quality standards were sufficiently protective to protect sustenance fishing became kind of the focal point of the dispute as the years went on. And in about 2015, EPA made a decision where it acknowledged that Maine did have regulatory jurisdiction in Indian waters, but simultaneously found that Maine's fishing designated use should be interpreted as being a designated use of sustenance fishing in Indian waters. And it made that determination without providing for any public notice or comment, and it was irregular. Also, designated uses are to be developed by the states, not by EPA. So this was, in our view, legally flawed, and the state challenged that decision, and that case is still technically pending. But when the change of administrations took the last year, the governor and I did was to kind of take a step back and stop approaching this issue from the standpoint of what the state was required to do as a matter of law, and instead kind of approach it from the perspective of what should the state do under its state authority. And so that allowed us to have a conversation with the leaders of the 4 tribes and their attorneys and their environmental professionals on their staff to negotiate the terms of water quality standards that were designed to be protective of sustenance fishing in certain waters that are of significance to the main tribes. And that was a very successful effort. It allowed us to have a totally different dynamic in our discussions and interactions with the tribes, and kind of collegially work together to develop these standards, which is what occurred. And what we did is we used used legislation in this last session to put together a bill that incorporated the standards that were negotiated. And DEP also has to go through the rulemaking process to reduce those standards to a numerical set of criteria, which we're in the process of doing. We're submitting that package to EPA as we're required to do for its approval. They've given every indication that they intend to approve it, and we all remain hopeful that the approval of those standards will allow for the settlement of the lawsuit by the state against EPA of that 2015 decision. So that's the kind of the narrative of how we got to where we are today. But I think one of the most important takeaways from the process is that we've taken the opportunity of this dispute to try to restore a sense of trust and goodwill between the state and the tribes, and hopefully we can use this to do similar things in other contexts and continue to improve that relationship.
We'll go right down the line.
All right. The biggest one of municipal impact was existed for coastal properties as an attempt to protect the shellfish industry. Septic system inspection for the sale of coastal properties already existed. So this extended it inland towards other water bodies, including wetlands and rivers and lakes. Important on a couple of fronts. Obviously, the environmental one, those resources should be protected from our waste as much as the coastal realms, but there are many regulated communities that must regulate for stormwater, and one of the pieces for stormwater is fecal chloroform and content. So municipal officials spend a lot of time chasing sources, sometimes only to find that it's a natural source, but this provides an opportunity, in theory, for these problematic septic systems to be addressed at the time of sale. There is a lot of questions as to whether or not there are ample inspection standards that are in existence that could actually catch some of the failing septic systems. That still is a question out there, as well as a number of the trained individuals to actually carry this out. However, it's an important step towards at least giving municipalities some sort of shot that they don't have to buy into, that the person that buys the property has prior to and can actually mitigate a source that is a problem for them prior to them having to find it downstream.
So let me talk about the bottom 2 bills, which deal with rivers, and then I'll talk about the top 2, which deal with lakes. So on rivers, this is one of the huge success stories of the state of Maine, what we've accomplished in our rivers over the last 2 decades in particular, but it's been a process that has lasted longer than that. This year we celebrated the 20th anniversary of removal of the Edwards Dam, and the Kennebec River now has more than 2 million alewives returning every spring. There's sturgeon, there's shad, there's more work to be done in the Kennebec, but it's the Penobscot similarly is another success story. The Penobscot River Restoration Project, removing dams, upgrading fish passage systems, particularly at Milford, and the Nature Lakes bypass at Howland. That's an amazing project, and the results are extraordinary. So more than 2 million alewives returned this year, more than 1,000 salmon have returned, more than 1,000 shad have returned. So the river reclass bill it needs to be seen in that context. Every 3 years, DEP is supposed to bring forward a waters reclassification bill. It was 9 years since one was brought forward to the legislature. This particular package provides upgrades to 400 rivers and streams in the state of Maine, including some really important brook trout habitat that includes the fish stream going near Patton, also a number of streams that go into Webb Lake and Weld, Back Brook and Limington, but importantly also some important stretches in the Penobscot. And the classification bill also requires that the river remain free-flowing below the Milford Dam. So that means that there will, we will keep that habitat intact that's been established by the Penobscot River Restoration Project. That's a really important package of upgrades. What the commissioner did on the sustenance fishing bill is heroic and deserves an enormous amount of praise by this state. This was an issue at his confirmation hearing, and he made a commitment to legislators, including Representative Bramlett here, that he would focus significant attention on reaching out to Maine's tribes to negotiate and develop a sustenance fishing protection strategy. He did that. He spent an enormous amount of time with the tribes, visiting them, and developing that package of designated areas for sustenance fishing. A source of tremendous tension between the tribes and the state for a number of years, and it was an enormous effort and deserves more attention than it has received so far. On the two lake bills, the septic inspection bill is one that had been brought forward in a previous legislative session by Representative Hilliard. It was vetoed or defeated. I forget what happened to it. That was back in the era when almost every bill was defeated because of vetoes. This was an important one. So when the hearing was held, Paul Hunt from the Portland Water District testified that for Sebago Lake, there are something like 4,000 lots that are within 200 feet of the lake. And on those lots, and that's the water supply for 200,000 Mainers. On those lots, there's 2,700 septic systems, and 900 of those were built before 1974. And so we have a really important water supply for a large percentage of the state that is potentially vulnerable to malfunctioning septic systems. So we're pleased that bill was passed. And on the other funding bill, which was on Lake Smart funding and also the Lake Stewards program, those are both incredibly important programs for the protection of our lakes. Our lakes provide $2 to $3 billion worth of economic activity to the state every year. They support, on estimate, 52,000 jobs are connected to our lakes. Protecting the water quality of our lakes is a big deal. What formerly was called the Volunteer Lake Monitoring Program, which is now Lake Stewards, involves hundreds and hundreds of volunteers, some who've been doing this for 40 years, monitoring the water quality of our lakes. It's the envy of the country, what we have in place here. And the amount of volunteer time that they devote has been estimated at something like $800,000 a year. This has not been funded at the level it deserves, so the increased funding that was brought forward by Denny Keschel on that one is important. And the Lake Smart program, which the previous administration kind of chucked off of DEP into the arms of then Congress of Lakes Association, but now it's called Maine Lake Society. Without much funding, that's also incredibly important. That's an education program and certification of appropriate management of lands that are in the shoreline zone. So increased funding in both of those areas is important for the safety net of our lakes, and for many communities that are based on lakes, the quality of their lake water ties directly to property values and municipal budgets and their ability to function as communities. So protecting our lakes is tightly connected to the health and vitality of many communities in the state.
Curtis, yeah.
Not too much to add other than, my son and I are avid fishermen, and like many people in the audience, I think there's a lot of, family camps in your history. Same is true with my family. My wife's family has had a camp up in central Maine since the 1940s. They got their septic system installed probably in the late 70s. And it's still there, but like I think with most families, there's not any intention to ever sell that property. So, we certainly care about these issues. I remember the realtors, I think, were the ones that probably raised the biggest concerns with that bill. Yeah, the only ones.
They were the only.
About how much it was gonna cost then, is it gonna hang up property transfers, that kind of stuff, or should it be voluntary? So it definitely an interesting discussion. That's all I have there.
Right, and you can tell that we don't have people every person that was involved with all these issues, and there are people in the audience who represent some other people who care about, for example, the reclassification of the waters of the state. That affects a lot of point source discharges and stormwater going into the rivers and how they're regulated. And so it's mostly more industrial or even municipal than the stormwater. So as we get into questions, those people who represent those can chime in. The next topic is toxics, and we put this one sort of together around a couple of bills. The first one, LD 1433, took a lot of time, significant bill for the committee and the state. The first thing it does is it prohibits the sale of food packaging containing phthalates, effective January 2022. And then for PFAS, DEP is given the authority to adopt a rule if they get information that there are safer alternatives out there, and they look at the toxicity, and then they propose a rule and it comes back. So that one requires more investigation and work by the department before that control occurs. And then there's a general piece of that for other substances in food packaging. This is all focused around food packaging. If it gets information and makes findings similar around the toxicity and presence in the environment. And that was modeled after the children's products law. LD 906 is a ban on coal tar pavement sealant. So it prohibits the sale of coal tar sealant effective October 1st, 2023. And it prohibits the use of coal tar, sealant on driveways and parking areas effective October 1st, 2024. So that's an actual ban of a product for toxic reasons. So Curtis, why don't we start at your end if you have things?
Yeah, so our understanding of 1433 is there's going to be a number of steps involved with doing it. And I think this is the biggest challenge any of us face is, as well as the state, being a small state with limited resources, is once you identify a chemical of concern on a certain level, that's fine, but then what's the alternative? And is the alternative actually going to be safer or not? And this bill, I think, actually perfectly encapsulates that. We all know the concern with PFAS and phthalates, but what are the other alternatives out there? And so as the DEP goes through this process and trying to identify this, are they going to have enough resources at their disposal to accurately do that? We're hopeful that there's going to be cooperation with other states that are also taking a look at it. And oftentimes, we're ones that are in there that are saying, is there the possibility of a federal solution? Now, I recognize with the current administration, that's probably not likely, but you can understand the importance of that it gets very difficult for an individual state like Maine to sometimes go it alone. And that's the concern we generally raise when we're in front of the committee of, how is this going to impact a Maine-based food manufacturer? How is it going to impact products that are coming into the state? And how are you going to regulate some of these products where, for better or worse, more and more people are shopping online and you can get things a lot more easily. So are you putting your brick and mortar retailers at a disadvantage? So for this one, there is a good amount of time leading up to 2022 to try to work through this. We don't know what the alternatives are out there yet that will work in all these different types of situations. And then the other angle is, if these chemicals are present, just because they're present, what is the level that's in there? Is it concerned? Does it get transferred to food or not? There is a lot of science behind it, but we think those things are worth exploring.
Yeah, just very quickly, we're pleased with the passage of both of these bills. 1433, I think we're the first state in the country to do this. There's still an implementation process that's important, as Curtis is describing. But we think that with the heightened attention to PFAS and phthalates, it's important for us to focus on reducing our exposure to that, and having it in food packaging is an obvious place to look. On the coal tar pavement sealing bill, this is an interesting one where the sponsor, Maddie Daughtry, introduced it initially in 2013 and it was defeated. And then she used her exact same testimony in 2017 with the exact same bill, and it was defeated. And this year she brought forward the exact same testimony again in 2019, and she actually didn't even change the bill number by mistake in the testimony she used. And for those of us who work up in the State House, that's not uncommon for us to dust off old testimony and reuse it, but this time it passed. And the facts on the ground haven't changed much. Low hardware don't use this particular coal tar-based product. It is definitely leaching off into our waterways, and there are substitutes which are safer based on asphalt-based sealants and latex sealants. And so this is one where let's just move away from this potential contaminant to our waterways.
Again, from the municipal perspective, our boots on the ground guys were there testifying about this because they cannot control what gets spread on private property. However, they are having to mitigate for the effects of the runoff of this, both in stormwater and also a concern within drinking water. So this was a big bill for them to get through, and it's also an appropriate state level response to something that is beyond the control of a municipal boundary. And that's a really important thing to be thinking about when we're looking at environmental regulations, is making sure that we're actually looking at it from a whole systems point of view. And our LD 906 did just that. 1433 might be something that would be similarly appropriate in dealing with the PFAS situation. The PFAS situation is already impacting municipal budgets significantly. Municipalities are already having to change everything that they're doing with their municipal sludge, and that is costing far more. Some communities in excess of 67% more for that particular budget line. So they can't stop the flow of this. And similarly with the coal tar sands, we have to actually think about what's happening in the middle and how we're actually going to be mitigating this, because there is no plan. There is no way currently to actually remove this stuff in municipal sludge. If they're bringing it into a landfill, I think we'll probably get into that a little bit later. The leachate from that landfill also needs to be mitigated because it still has the PFAS in it. So then it goes to a waste treatment plant, and that waste treatment plant then trucks it back to the landfill. So are we just moving it around? And are we going to continue to do that for 90 years, or are we going to have a plan that understands the level, the response, and actually have some sort of soft and costing everybody a lot of money?
Yeah, I completely agree with those sentiments. And as some of you know, the governor created a task force on PFAS earlier this year, and it's in the process of wrapping up its work and coming up with its recommendations. But very broadly, I think what you'll see come out of that is kind of a two-pronged strategy where source reduction is on the front end, the ideal that we will be pursuing. And this bill 1433 is a good example of how we can start the process of trying to PFAS is tumor applications. That's going to take a lot of work, but bills like this one are going to be an important part of the process. I think we need to bring focus to disclosure, to where these compounds are being used, and focus on the development of safe alternatives to them. So 1433 is a good example of a bill that works toward that goal. But the other prong of the strategy is, as Rebecca was alluding to, finding a way to permanently destroy these compounds once they're in the waste stream, because short of that, as she said, you're just moving these compounds around in the environment and cycling them through in ways that inevitably lead to environmental exposure and public health threats. So we need to develop a strategy in this state and in the country generally where we are confident in a process that permanently destroys these compounds. And the task force has been giving a lot of attention to different strategies. We at DEP are giving a lot of time and attention to considering the most responsible strategies to do that, but we're really just beginning this process, and it's going to be with us for a long time. On the second bill, on 906, I would just echo what Pete said. I think this is an important victory. There were very real water quality impacts to the use of this product, and there were adequate alternatives available. So kudos to Maddie Daughtry for her persistence in getting this through. It's a great result.
Hey, Bill, can I just jump in? Yeah, a couple more things. Earlier I was talking about what, some major retailers are doing in the environmental space with CO2 reduction. But there's quite a bit of other things they're doing as well. If you're a major retailer these days, and it would apply to other businesses as well, you're not just looking at CO2 reduction, you're looking at things like ethical sourcing or conflict minerals or sustainable forestry. So I know, I'm glad Pete mentioned on the coal tar sealants that the major retailers had already moved away from these products a number of years ago, which was great. But even in terms of carpeting and flooring, there's orthophthalates and PFAS in some of those products that are now being phased out. So I know one of my major retailers, their PFAS is going to be on carpeting by January of this year. So it's not just food products. There's other products, and there is a lot of progress being made in this space.
I will say that for the PFAS, there are companies in Maine that make food packaging that has PFAS actually for grease and water resistance and things like that. And those are the ones that we're trying to focus on. What subjects, as Curtis said, what subjects are available, how can we move away from them? And they are working on that. It's a question of how soon they can get there. Next topic, product bans. This was, the first bill is the styrofoam food container. Restaurant thing, but I think Curtis, it affects.
It does. We actually didn't testify on this bill. A number of municipalities have already passed polystyrene, and we'll get into this a bit when we get to the bags. But from our perspective, there were a number of communities that had passed a polystyrene ban, and the good news was that made it kind of easy. So a lot of retailers had already, or restaurants, had really moved away from styrofoam coffee cups and that type of thing. But this was going to come at a statewide level. So in terms of just having consistency across the state was fine. It definitely impacts food service and restaurants more. One of the challenges that continues to exist is, and we knew that the goal was the coffee cups. Those are what you see alongside the road. That's what people either throw out the window or fly out the back of their pickup truck, whatever it is. I see them, you see them. But the other products that come in polystyrene foam, really weren't a problem. So what you have now with this law, and it is an issue for some of our smaller grocery retailers, is that, the Purdue chicken that comes in from out of state can still be in a polystyrene tray. But if you are packing your meat or chicken here locally, you can't use polystyrene. You have to use something different, and it's a little bit more expensive. So that does put the Maine-based businesses at a little bit of a competitive disadvantage. It's fine. We're not disagreeing with the bill. We like I said, we didn't touch it. The devil of the details, and that's one of the things that's out there. And the state is limited in what they can regulate. They can't really tell Purdue that they can't do it. That interferes with interstate commerce. So that's where it gets in a little sticky area. Do you want me to dive right into bags?
The other bill is the single-use plastic bags, and effective 2020, April 2020. retailers shall not use or make available to the customers these bags. So they provide a 5 cent for reusable or paper bags.
Yeah. So this is obviously an issue we've been working on for a number of years, and a number of things have happened over the last, I would say, 18 to 24 months. So where we were as an association and our counterparts at the Maine Grocers and Food Producers Association was, we kept seeing a lot of these different ordinances crop up across different communities. I think the total count was somewhere in the 20s, 24 or so. And unlike the polystyrene ordinance, it seemed like every single community was rewriting their ordinance from scratch. So there were 24 different ordinances and 24 different draftings of them. And they all had little subtle differences. So if you're a Rennie's or a Hannaford or someone who operates in multiple communities, it was really getting to be a challenge to comply with these different ordinances. And I can tell you, my larger members in particular take compliance incredibly seriously. And so there were actually a couple of humorous things that happened along the way. One of the communities down south, when they drafted and passed their ordinance, unintentionally banned reusable bags. So it was one of my members who came to us and said, look, we're trying to comply with this law. This is how we're reading it. We think they actually banned reusable bags. We pull it out, start looking at it. We look at it and we said, oh, we think you're right. So we called up the city manager down there and said, hey, I know we're about 45 days away from implementation. Guys, this is what it actually says. And they looked at it and they were like, oh, something. And so, we laugh about it now, but it was actually a fairly significant process to have to go back into that community, get them to fix it. They had to delay enforcement for 4 or 6 months till we could get back together, draft new language and fix that. And so there are a lot of little things like that, various ordinances. I ended up having a fairly large spreadsheet of all the different communities with is it paper and plastic? Who's the enforcement arm? Is it the code enforcement officer? Is it the town manager, city manager? One of the other quirky ones that happened is some of these ordinances were either passed by city councils or by referendum. The ones by referendum were sometimes a little humorous as well. So Camden, when they passed theirs, they were the only one in the state where the police were the enforcement arm. And that really didn't make a lot of sense either. And so the difference between these local ordinances, which were all different, and trying to approach this from a state level was that once we were to get a law passed here in the state, that's going to amp up the compliance that much more. So these communities, and Rebecca, I'm not faulting your municipalities. I know they're citizen run and all that, but it really was a challenge. And so one of our big motivations was we need some consistency here. So we knew, 20 plus communities was now 20+% of the population of Maine. We had enough time then to get feedback from consumers that whether it was a fee or a ban, consumers eventually adapted. There were some stumbling blocks along the way, but ultimately consumers adapted. And that was a big piece as well. So our leadership, the leadership that we did 2018 and really started diving into this. We started surveying our members. We started going a little bit deeper and saying, okay, if there was a statewide law, what should it look like? And we came up with some principles. So pretty much last summer, 2018, our boards had said, all right, we're going to pursue this in the next legislative session, regardless of what the legislative landscape is going to look like. And I would say going into the election a year ago, we were actually trying to think of possible Republican sponsors that we can approach to bring forward our bill. But the election happened and, Democrats became control of the House and Senate and the executive branch. And so that kind of made the path a little bit easier, but it certainly wasn't going to be a sure thing. So the election happened. One of the first things we did is when we, those of us that spend time in Augusta, you kind of know there are certain legislators are absolutely going to win re-election and they already be in the leadership position. So Representative Ralph Tucker was already the House Chair of the A&R Committee. We met with him about a week after the election and sat down and said, look, we're willing to sit down and support a statewide law on plastic bags. And so we had a great conversation with him. He urged us to reach out to NRCM, which we did do. And that started kind of a larger process where it was actually really collaborative in working through with Pete's counterpart, Sarah Nichols, and going through a lot of the different stuff. And there was a lot of give and take on both sides. Like I said, the devil's in the details with these things. So what we came up with and what ultimately passed was pretty similar to the draft, and a couple minor tweaks, but nothing major, is starting Earth Day next year, plastic bags at all of retail, not just grocery and restaurants, but retail, restaurants, and grocery will be banned. There will be a 5-cent fee, at least a 5-cent fee on paper bags and plastic bags that are greater than 4 mils thick. And the 4 mil issue, but there was a thickness threshold of plastic bags that are out there. And that was pretty much what was in the majority of the ordinance. That kind of brought consistency to it. But one of the things we really pushed for was we needed statewide preemption. We needed consistency across the state with this. And I know Maine Municipal usually has an issue with these types of preemption, but it was critically important for us because if we weren't going to get that consistency, you know, the Rennies of the world or Next County Blues or whoever was still going to have that compliance issue if there's a town that does things just a little bit different. So it was a good collaborative process. We didn't get everything we wanted. I don't think the environmental community got everything we wanted, but I would say we actually have now a model that I think other states are going to look to very closely and perhaps adopt. So I don't know where else we can go from there. If you want to chime in a little, Peter?
Sure. Rebecca and I know want to chime in on.
So let me just first say that the title of this product ban is a little bit misleading. These are not products. Foam packaging and single-use plastic bags. None of us go out to find the best color, price, and other features of these throwaway disposable pieces of plastic that come with other products that we purchase. And these are avoidable pieces of trash that mostly have a life that is measured in minutes. And we didn't use plastic bags until 1979. And right now they're distributed at 1 million bags per minute that just is being pushed out on us. And then we don't know what to do with them. Only 6% of plastic bags are recycled at present. So there's a huge volume of plastic broadly, but also directly from plastic bags. The average American gets 1,500 of these single-use plastic bags a year. And so we throw them into our trash because we don't really recycle them. And they clog up the sorting facilities at places like EcoMaine. So this title, it should be ban, it should be avoidable plastic waste ban or something. Should be the name of this title. And this is a success story. Both of these are important bills. The foam packaging bill was made as the first in the nation. So that kudos to the governor. She had 10 days to sign this bill. Maryland's governor had it on his desk, and she signed it within just a couple of days after it landed on her desk. And so it put Maine in a leadership position as establishing this bill on foam food packaging. And just to give you a sense of the volumes that this can affect. So the elementary school at Sakarapa Elementary School in Westbrook has replaced their foam trays with reusable trays in their cafeteria, and they are getting rid of 1,300 foam trays per week that are not going into the landfill. That's one little elementary school that has taken 1 trays with reusable. So kind of writ large, there is a large volume of styrofoam in use that now will be replaced with biodegradable and other reusable forms. And same thing is true with plastic bags. This is a reusable bag promotion law. And people can still, and that should be a culture change that we can adopt to. We're already seeing it in the 25 towns now that have adopted.
But I'm not going to. I'm going to point out the fact that these two things wouldn't happen unless it were for municipal officials and municipal leaders who were driving this at the local level. So while they were problematic and created all of these issues, also progressive, and so these are appropriate level responses. We don't like preemption in any way, shape, or form, because D 1532 is that it creates a fee that goes, and if every environmental rule that came down had the same thing, then your property taxes probably would not be hit so heavily. So I'm going to also use this as an opportunity to talk about tax policy, to talk about environmental policy funding. Because our environmental regulation. So we really need to actually look at some tax policy initiatives that capture all-in revenue to address a lot of these issues as well. So I would encourage you to reach out to your legislatures every time they bring forward an environmental law and ask them how they're going to fund that and which taxes they're going to raise on every municipal delivery of these. So there, I didn't
Commissioner, anything to add?
Just quickly, we agree these are very good waste hierarchy, the goals of the hierarchy. They're simple. We view them as self-implementing. One of them, 289, does give DEP rulemaking authority. We're not planning on exercising that. I don't think it's necessary. The only concerns or reservations we have about legislation like this can be in terms of the burden they can bring to the agency in implementation. These do not represent examples of that, but we have a small staff that's responsible for working on these issues, incredibly capable staff and dedicated, but few in number, so we have to be careful about resource issues on this.
In the interest of time, I'm going to do the next two together, which are product stewardship. This is 1431 has DEP developing a program to look at packaging fees that can be put into a fund that goes to municipalities. These are based on recycling and are in the process of doing that to help promote recycling programs and disposal at the municipal level. The next LD 1594 is a carryover bill that is for consumer batteries, both single-use and rechargeable batteries. For those batteries to have a, and that's a bill that will come back. For waste management in general, there was a bill that was passed, as the commissioner just mentioned, based on the hierarchy. And this one also has a twist because the state owns the landfill in Old Town. And this is really talking about how much municipal solid waste should be put in that state-owned disposal facility. How do we use that facility to be, consistent with our hierarchy? And there's going to be another bill coming in the next session to continue that conversation. The other thing it adds is a reporting requirement for the actual recycling facilities. Every year have to report on that so we can start tracking the types and amounts of recycled material. Municipalities have to do something every 2 years for their programs as well. So I was going to take these two topics because they both deal with waste together. So Commissioner, do you want to start us off on that?
Sure. On 1431, we've been taking a hard look at what other jurisdictions have done in this way to discourage the use of non-recyclable materials in packaging and incentivize the use of readily recyclable materials in packaging, and also find a way through the fees that would be associated with that incentive and disincentive program to create a market for recyclables that needs some help at this point. So we're looking at Europe, we're looking at Canada, we're looking at other states and some quarters. And so we're trying to figure out what's realistic, but we're in the middle of that process and we'll be prepared to go public with something pretty soon. Let's see. And on 112, I think Representative Tucker's bill. That's another one where we're engaged in discussions right now with affected parties about what we can do to further the goals of responsibly using the capacity in the state-owned landfill. That's a perennial issue of controversy in the Natural Resources Committee, and it's kind of an interesting one in state government, since the landfill is state-owned and is administered by another branch of state government, and we, DEP, are the regulators. There's some inherent tension in that dynamic, but we are, continuing to use our authority as regulators to try to promote the goals of the waste hierarchy as it applies to that landfill.
LD 1430 waste, it is everyone's waste, and they are simply in charge or basically tasked with managing its flow. They can neither stop it nor or have limited resources, basically, in terms of actually responding to this, and particularly to recycling markets. So it was estimated that about 60% of what goes into the recycling or is non-recyclable is actually packaging. And it's really hard for consumers to make decisions about packaging 4 or 5 different plastics involved in that particular piece of material that is shipped to you. So it's really hard for the consumer to manage their recycling, no matter how diligent they are with this, and it's really hard for municipalities to manage that as well. And if municipalities are going to get dinged for what the consumers do or don't do, then this might be the more appropriate response. There's a lot of complexity about Maine's recycling market. There are different recycling facilities which have capacity to recycle different types of materials, and they often independently. Ultimately, the hope is that we're going to be pushed about what is happening with this material and relieve some of that burden at the local level.
So on 1431, the DEP will be bringing forward a draft bill by December 16th. That's what the resolve directed, and that passed unanimously. As Rebecca's described, Maine people don't really know what to do with all this packaging that's arriving. There's no incentives for manufacturers to reduce the amount of packaging that they're using in the deliveries that are going, and that means taxpayers for end-of-life disposal of all this packaging, and it's estimated that $16 or $17 million a year in cost by Maine residents is going into just the end-of-life disposal of packaging waste. So we have a long and successful history of extended producer responsibility laws. Our bottle bill is one. We have them for rechargeable batteries, for mercury-containing lamps, electronic waste, mercury auto switches in vehicles, used paint. And this would build on that record of success for extended producer responsibility. We believe that producers, manufacturers, should be responsible for some of the end-of-life cost expenses that are being imposed on towns to deal with this volume of waste. Laws like this are in 28 countries in the European Union, 5 provinces in Canada, Australia, Russia, and Brazil. And in many of those jurisdictions, to 80% of this material. So we're hopeful that a draft bill will come forward that will spark the conversation that's necessary about appropriate allocation of costs so that there is a revenue stream that goes to towns that helps relieve their end-of-life recovery and disposal expenses associated with this. And this is, it is an area that needs attention because we have a bit of a crisis right now of the world's trash. So we have a recycling market that is struggling, and many towns across are recycling or terminating some of their town. So the model that we want to go to is that there would be a more rational and parallel system across all of the communities to fund that disposal cost.
So yeah, without question, 1431 is probably one of the biggest issues we'll be looking at this coming session. We're very interested to see the DEP report shortly, but I will give the DEP a lot of credit. They held a number of really comprehensive listening sessions back in the early part of the fall. It was a great opportunity to really have some in-depth back and forth. As I said, when we're before the legislature in a committee, the legislators get to ask us questions on our testimony. We don't often have a chance to questions back. So in this case, we were really able to have some really good back and forth with DEP staffers about what they were thinking. And there was, some things that we raised that they hadn't thought of as well. Because as this process was undergoing, Amazon box that's coming to your home, but this resolve is also looking at not only what's known as primary packaging, but secondary, tertiary, ancillary. And from a retailer's point of view, a lot of people don't really, even a small convenience, about 3,000 different products, different stock keeping units. If you're a smaller store, you can probably have 25,000 to 50,000. And if you're a department store, you probably have well over 100,000 different SKUs. So those are all different products that are coming in and out of retailers. And often there's a very different supply chain for a lot of them. So understanding the supply chain process, how this is actually going to be applied, there's a lot of questions there. I know California was kind of going down this path and it didn't happen before their session adjourned a couple months ago. It is a big issue. So we're going to be spending a lot of time on this, really looking into it, getting into the details of it. It's not a simple solution, but I absolutely agree with Rebecca and other folks. As a state, we need to have international markets have changed that conversation and put it more front and center. Shifting a little bit to the EPR products that Pete mentioned, in addition to batteries, one of the things I've actually been working on more recently and spending quite a bit of time on is mattresses. Mattresses are a very difficult item to dispose of. Right now, the majority of them get landfilled. We're told that eventually what happens is they float to the top of landfills. Now, a mattress is basically made of all the same materials. So there's fabric, there's foam, there's steel, and then there's wood in terms of a box spring. So none of those items are toxic, but they're big and bulky and hard to dispose of. So we've been working with a lot of different partners. We actually had a pretty extensive meeting yesterday. EcoMaine was there, PERC was there, perhaps trying to deconstruct or disassemble these mattresses to either be able to use them as waste to energy or to be able to get, really the only marketable material in a mattress is the steel, but getting the springs out and getting it into a compact form that makes it valuable enough to ship to the markets is going to be a challenge. So we're working on that. We're working on trying to get a pilot program up and running to see if we can try to deal with these. Connecticut and Rhode Island have passed mattress recycling laws that attach some sort of fee to the price of a mattress. I think it's like $18 or so per box for a mattress in Rhode Island. I'm not sure what Connecticut is, but somewhere in that range. We don't know what it would cost in Maine to do that, but we're taking a look at that. And then in terms of like e-waste, Maine was the first state in the country to pass our e-waste law, and a number of states have followed suit. But one of the things that we've been made aware of more recently is now that other states have come on board, they found more efficient ways to do it. So Maine's cost per ton is really one of the highest in the countries. And so we've been working with DEP, and they've been great about starting to have a conversation about how we can streamline and improve Maine's program for e-waste. So that's kind of a good thing as well. As far as batteries go, Bill, I know that's a carryover bill. I do know that the one difference there with that bill this time is that the battery manufacturers are not, I don't know, This is gonna try to develop a product stewardship program for regular household alkaline batteries. There's already one for rechargeable batteries. And what the industry says is, as a consumer, you don't really discriminate between a rechargeable and a battery. You just see a battery and you don't want to throw it out. And so you're throwing these alkaline batteries in with the rechargeable ones, and falls back on the manufacturers, but we're also getting what are known as these orphan batteries, which are unbranded ones that may come in toys or other products that still get into the waste stream, and how do those get paid for? So it's going to be an interesting discussion. The other bill that's not on there, that's also a carryover bill, is the drug take-back bill. I think that's 1660, is that right? If my number's correct. And we've been working with Senator Gratwick on that. There are other states that have some good models. We think there is something that potentially could move forward and carry over. Senator Gratwick and I met back, and that goes moving forward.
Thanks, Chris. So at this point, I was going to open up a lot of issues, obviously. So I think we have 10 or 15 minutes for questions.
Yes, absolutely. We're going to give the commissioner the microphone to meter it out to the panel. And then if you have a question from the audience, I'm going to give you the mic. And Bill, I'll let you select the questioners and I'll be the runner.
All right, let's start at the back.
And then the front,
Yeah.
and then the back.
Right. Who has a question? Anybody? Here's one.
Thanks, Sarah LeBeau with the Environmental Health Strategy Center. Just a quick question about 1431. When you're looking at the recycled materials and stuff and the fee structure, are you taking into account any sort of toxic chemicals that might be in some of those products? So like bottles have phthalates in them, some of the stuff that's grease resistant or stain resistant that might be recyclable but has PFAS in it, to make sure that those manufacturers have to account for that too.
Yeah, all those issues are part of the discussion. I can't say what's going to emerge from that discussion in the bill that we present, but that's all been part of the discussion we've had.
Hi, John Robinson here. I have a question for you about the climate change reduction, carbon reduction bill. So there's a lot of people with a lot of rooftops who like to do things with solar. Are there subsidies or are there any plans to help people transition to a carbon neutral future from the state level? I mean, that's I guess that's the biggest question I have.
Yeah, well, the idea of transitioning to a carbon neutral future is really the charge of the council, broadly speaking. So I think we will see come out of the Climate Council process a series of recommendations and strategies that are designed to achieve that and to subsidize activities like which. Can you hear me okay? So yeah, rooftop solar, taking advantage of brownfields and landfills and other sites with a history of industrial usage. All those sites are ideal locations for solar development. I think we are going to see a set of incentives coming out, whether it's through the current PUC rulemaking process or through recommendations of the Climate Council or a combination. All that's going to be a big part of the rollout of solar in this state in the next couple of years. Do you want to?
Just very quickly. So we didn't talk today about the solar bills that were passed this year. You guys have dealt with that in the previous session, but gross metering and restore the net metering, people who don't have rooftops that are south facing or they're blocked by wind, by trees. So the legislature did pass a really important comprehensive solar bill that deals with community solar projects. And we previously had a limit, an arbitrary limit of 10 participants. That limit, PUC will manage a process of auctions that will accept bids. And we will see hundreds of megawatts of community solar projects. And we're seeing a bit of both a land rush and a, a, remarkable level of solar industry interest in the state of Maine that we have never seen before. And they're here because of this change in policy. These property owners and those interested in having access to solar previously, and it's exciting, but it's also going to create some challenges to manage moving forward.
Hi, Kevin Roach, member of American Wind Energy Association. We just had a National Offshore Wind Conference down in Boston back in October, and you mentioned that we need to get to 5,000 megawatts of energy. The only way to get there, you have to include our offshore wind resources. Yet, there was only a handful of us from Maine that made it down to Boston, and didn't run into anyone from Maine government. We have this initiative out there for 2030. What are our plans to really get a $1.4 million and Department of Energy subsidy up for the Aquamentus project? But that's just to bring this up to.
Better? Oh, this is way better. Coast, and so we don't have the opportunity to pursue the level in Europe, and increasingly the bids that are coming in Massachusetts and elsewhere along the Atlantic seaboard. So it's really deep offshore, and as you probably know, the PUC yesterday approved the contract for the Aquamentus, which is a big deal. Cleared the path for that. And that's important, and it's quite possible that Maine can be on the front edge of the development of deep water offshore floating rigs. And our sense is that that's still probably a decade away, but you're absolutely right that in the 2030 to 2040 period, there needs to be widespread deployment of offshore wind, and increasingly in that period, it will be possibly 20 miles out to sea. And we hope that, I think Maine would be in a better place if the Statoil contract hadn't been terminated. But we are the possibility that it could break in a way that is very important for both leadership on offshore wind and jobs and economic potential from it.
Commissioner, do you have any insights on that particular issue? So DEP is not the lead on this, but I know the governor is a big supporter of offshore wind development, and the Federal Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is putting together a 3-state task force, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Maine, designed to look at development in the federal waters. One of the focuses that we will have in Maine is, I think it's twofold. We want to ensure that development in federal waters off of our coast benefits Maine in terms of where the energy comes to shore and where it's used. That's a big issue, and it's not to be taken for granted greatly, and minimizes impacts on the fishing industry, which is also a big issue.
Another question?
Dear questioners, I may have to ask you to belt it out. We'll see if this one, no, he wants some more. There we go.
Hello, Kiara Frischkorn, a student at University of New England and a member of Maine Youth for Climate Justice. I have a question about 1532 about the ban on single-use plastic bags in retailer for the Retailer Association.
Bags, so produce bags are still going to be allowed. Bags that can be used for bulk. Going to a candy store and you want some Jelly Bellies or something, those will still be allowed. We worked with NRC and put in what we thought were some reasonable exemptions like produce bags, but things that other people don't think of. Dry cleaning bags. You pick up your your dress or your suit on a rainy day, you want something to protect it. So those will still be allowed. We're all gonna be changing a plastic bag. So you still probably want that plastic bag as well. So there's some reasonable exemptions in there, but produce bags is one of them.
Thank you very much.
I'm just gonna use this opportunity to thank Curtis and the grocers for the proactive role that they played, particularly in the, and that was really leadership in action. And Curtis, as you know, has already recently received an award for that work. So I just wanna, I didn't mention it earlier, but we really appreciate it when we can have the conversations to work legislation that helps protect Maine's environment. Thanks.
All right, I have a follow-up question. It's not working, but it's okay. So with the single-use plastic bags, I know that some of the municipal ordinances have exempted retailer stores. Is that gonna be, I mean, are they still gonna be obligated to provide recycling for the produce bags, the dry cleaner bags?
Other questions?
Take a mic, it's a token at this point. Ready to hand the token over, if you will belt it out.
And Marty, there's also someone over here on the far left who's been raising his hand.
I think there was something about battery recycling mentioned, and see this is ready to be recycled.
LD 1121 on the potable water as a necessity. And the general assistance part of that, is there any kind of formula as far as from ratepayers, bill payers back to any kind of general assistance?
I don't know anything about that, Bill. Does anybody on the panel?
No.
I don't know. You're asking about a formula for how the price of it?
Funding general assistance. It was a general assistance. But in how to fund that. Is there
Right,
any
no,
kind of
I
formula?
don't, no, it just gotta be.
Yeah, general assistance is generally refunded at 70% back to the municipality, so the municipality is obligated to provide general assistance under those state guidelines, but I believe it's by the state at this time, so that would be part of that.
There was something, a question here?
Yeah, I just, I don't even know if it's possible, but it always annoyed me, or has been annoying me for some time. I don't know why we didn't at least attempt to extract some kind of tariff on all this power flowing out of Canada through Maine to Massachusetts, where we feel like minimal or basically non-existent benefits really start analyzing things. But it really should, it would be really good if they could open that back up and we could at least consider somehow to extract energy and technology and environmental programs. The other comment, at some point they gotta stop researching so they can actually build stuff. I'm wondering quite frequently about that. Habib is a wonderful person, I love him and all that. He's a perpetual researcher. Anyway, there's wonderful things on the horizon in that offshore wind. I'm connected overseas with people who have a lot of interest. We gotta get the thing moving. Talk is wonderful. Building product that actually is producing energy is a whole different deal. We need to get to that level at some point, stay there at least on a plateau for now, maybe for 4 or 5 years, and then do it again to expand the programs even further.
We've loved you a softball, panel.
So we need another few hours to talk about some of those issues. I don't think I really need to open up that box of talking about the CMP corridor. We have some strong points of view on this. I think looking to the upcoming legislative session, if the citizen-initiated petition gets the 63,000 qualified signatures, there will be an issue before the next legislature on whether to adopt that language, which would direct the PUC to rescind their approval of the CMP corridor. They could adopt it, or they could send it to the voters. If it qualifies, most likely they would send it to the voters. It would be on the ballot in 2020, and the people of Maine would have the opportunity to to render their opinion on that project. I do agree with you that the University of Maine is a somewhat not the perfect fit for commercializing floating offshore wind projects. And so that we are where we are, and let's just hope that we can move in that direction. I'm going to use this minute and not get the mic just to say there's some things that happened in this legislative session that are important for all of you to know. There was a return to civility that we haven't seen in a while. It was extremely important. And I heard many comments by many from Bob Foley, a Republican state senator who received an award at the Environmental Health Strategy Center for his work on the toxics and packaging bill. He said, this year we started talking with one another again. That's extremely important. Here at the E2 Tech Council meeting in February, Joyce Taylor, the chief engineer at DOT, said it's nice to be talking about climate in public again. This legislative session, most of these bills that we're talking about passed with bipartisan support, many of them unanimous or close to unanimous. So there was a kind of both a return to normal order and a return to civility and a reconnection with the task of protecting the natural character of the state that was largely nonpartisan. And it feels really good to be back to where we have been for most of the last 50 years. And this year we passed well over 30 important environmental bills. We added a ton of new law to our statutes. There's a lot of, it's really quite remarkable how quickly we went from adopting a statute that requires that we all
haven't talked about, or just final wrap up comments.
I guess in terms of final comments, I mean, I mentioned them already. Packaging is very much on our radar screen. We're interested to see how this drug take-back bill goes. If we can do a pilot project on mattresses. The recent bill titles that went through, there wasn't anything. This past session, definitely there was a lot of work, just the volume of bills. Pete spends all his time in E&R